Hey everybody, welcome to today's video. Thanks so much for stopping by. On today's video, I want to talk to you about 7 easy steps on how to start your own podcast. A few weeks ago, I actually made a video specifically talking about tools for podcasting and what some of my favorite tools were. Now, I got some questions since then on honestly just some stuff to start your own podcast. Like, what is step 1 all the way into publishing your podcast for the first time? If you go back and reference my video from a couple weeks ago, it really has to do with somebody who started a podcast and wanting to take their podcast from good to great. On this video, I really want to focus on really how do you start? Like, what's the very first step and how do you get up and running for a podcast? The very first thing you got to decide is, what's your topic going to be? What do you want to talk about in your podcast? What's the format? Is it conversational? Is it recapping an event? Is it going to be like tools for trade type things? So the first thing is really truly choose your topic and just go for it. If you already have a topic in mind that you want to base on your podcast, you're already ahead of the game. That's step 1. Check it off your list. Step 2 is to decide your frequency of what the podcast is going to be. Is this going to be a weekly podcast? Or are you going to release it on Monday? Or are you going to release it on Friday? Is it going to be a monthly podcast? Is it going to be a daily podcast? Don't do a daily podcast. That would be a lot of work. But try to decide your frequency. And why this is important is, again, a podcast is for an audience. And just like a TV show back in the old days gets released on a very specific day that you actually want to go see, a podcast should ideally have somewhat of a frequency to it. Now, I can't help but try to speak into this topic of frequency. Now, just because you release on a frequent basis on a schedule does not mean you have to record on every single day of the week and publish 2 or 3 days later after you're done with the editing process. That's not what I mean. The best thing to get ahead of the game when it comes to podcasting is truly batch processing. And what I mean by that is, if you're going to publish a podcast, maybe try to get 2 or 3 or even 4 episodes of a podcast recorded all at once, so you can go back and edit on your own time and then release according to your schedule that you've already had in place. Don't try to record one podcast and then publish it, record another podcast and publish it. Try to record 1 or 2, at least hopefully 2 podcasts at one time. That way you'll give yourself a little bit of margin to try to schedule out in advance. Now, all these steps still have to do with preparation. We haven't pressed the record button on audio not once yet. This is all about preparation. The third step you got to decide is what platform you're going to host your podcast on. Now, what do I mean by that? The way podcasts work is you would record an audio file, you would upload it somewhere online and post it there so everybody can see. You then, once you have that posted online, the place you post it creates what's called an RSS feed that you submit to the iTunes store for approval. Now, there's lots of different places online you can try to actually host your podcast, but I have a few that I recommend. The first one that I want to show you right now is Squarespace. Squarespace is a great place you can actually not only set up a nice website, but you can also host a podcast via a blog section of Squarespace. The next one is called Libsyn. This is the tried and true Swiss Army knife of all podcasting people in the past. A lot of popular podcasts actually have been hosted on Libsyn. And as you can see, it's pretty cheap. It only starts at about $5 per month for a basic podcast. The second one that I'm pretty familiar with is what's called Podomatic. Now, I'm not a huge fan of Podomatic. I don't have any preference towards one of these podcasts whatsoever, or these podcast platforms whatsoever. However, I have used a few of them in the past. Squarespace is one that I currently use with my buddy John in Phoenix. We host a show that's called The Correspondence Podcast, and it's I just broke my rule about frequency. We're trying to post now once a month and try to get an episode every single month out to our audience. But Podomatic is one I use for what's called the Idea Talks, and that's with my pastor. We post on a very monthly basis. It's the last Monday of every month that we actually upload a podcast to the internet for all of our listening, or for all of our listeners too. Now, these 3 are the ones that I recommend. Each one has something very unique. Price points are different based on storage, how much bandwidth you need, how many listeners you're going to have. But honestly, any of them will provide what you need, and that is a place to store all your files online that'll generate an RSS feed, and then you can actually publish that to the iTunes store. Now that we're done with the preparation stage of how to start a podcast, let's talk about the actual recording session. Now, the video, again, I posted a couple weeks ago, has really to do with tools you might use if you're in the same room as each other and you're podcasting. So if I have my pastor over here and we want to do an episode, I can literally have him sit on my living room couch. I hold a microphone in my hand. He holds a microphone in his hand. We press record on the Zoom and it's good to go. However, that's not the way a lot of podcasts honestly work. A lot of podcasts have to do maybe 2 or 3 people that are on the podcast who don't even live in the same states, maybe even sometimes the same country as each other. So what do you do in that situation where the podcast recording session is not actually going to take place in the same location as each other? That's where you enter Skype and Ecamm Call Recorder. Now, a simple Skype video chat call is what my buddy John and I use in Phoenix, and where we schedule a time where we get on Skype together and we record by way of video our session. Now, the thing that we use specifically for the podcast, it's not a video podcast, it's an audio podcast. And that's the solution here. It's called Ecamm Call Recorder specifically for Skype. Now, this software is basically just a plugin that is always running as soon as Skype turns on. You'll see it's a little hover kind of button towards the bottom. And as soon as you press record on Skype, it'll also start recording on Ecamm Call Recorder. The reason I love this, it's not that crazy expensive. It's only $40 for the software. But when you're done with the podcast and you press stop for the recording, it'll generate multiple tracks of audio, one for you that you have in front of you and one for the person that you have on the other microphone. And it's really nice because you want multi-track audio recording when you actually step into the next phase, and that's editing, because it really gives you a lot more flexibility to kind of separate levels, to balance them out, to cut off when somebody's talking. You might have background audio in the background. Ecamm Call Recorder is a great solution for that and will help you out with trying to balance that back and forth. So by far, if you're not going to be in the same proximity of each other and you actually want to still do a podcast, try to use Skype and try to use Ecamm Call Recorder for a good solution. The next step is really when you actually want to go ahead and press record. You have your hosting, you've bought your hosting online, you're going to upload all your files to one specific site that you bought storage for. You've gone through the approval process through iTunes. Now you're actually ready to press record on the record button. What do you use? Do you use your smartphone? Do you use your built-in mic that's on your laptop? What have you? Sure, you can do all of that, but honestly, for very minimal cost, you're talking under $100, you can take that little bit of quality that could be on a webcam microphone and step it up a notch and make your podcast sound a whole lot better and more professional. Now, this entire video is being recorded via a Shure MV51 microphone. It's not that expensive. It's about an $80 to $80 mic. I'll put the links in the description below. And this video is being recorded with that mic. I love this microphone. I got it kind of mounted on a boom arm. It's somewhat, about 8 to 6 inches away from my face. It picks up a nice pattern. It has really great sound. And again, it's really good because it just plugs in via USB to my computer. And instead of using just an okay quality built-in web microphone, I'm using this microphone instead, and it makes it sound a whole lot better. Now, that's the microphone. If I was using a recording device like a Zoom that I talked about in my last video a couple weeks ago, that's a great capture device for actually recording the session. If you're using Skype and you're using Ecamm Call Recorder, your laptop is the capture device. So all the audio is going to be stored on that device for you during that entire session so you can play back later. If you've never done that before, I would maybe just do a test round. So maybe like a 2 to 5 minute recording session where you're on your computer and really trying to just mimic a podcast. Press stop, see what happens. So you can save the file and you can actually generate a file where it's saved on your laptop and you can go back and edit later. That's what I would suggest. Now, the 6th step in the process is editing. Now, this is one of my favorite steps in the process, and it's really where you truly kind of get the magic to happen. But you don't have to be a nerd like I am or a geek to really try to make your podcast go further. There's a couple different pieces of software that I recommend for editing podcast. I use Logic Pro on my computer. You can use a free software like GarageBand. If you're on a PC platform, you can use like Audacity or something like that, or Adobe Audition if you have a Creative Cloud membership. All those are great platforms that you can use to actually edit audio, and it'll turn out really well. A couple things and recommendations I have when it comes to editing a podcast. Just know that it's going to take time. So the amount of time that you actually have recorded the entire podcast, if you think about it, you have to spend that exact same time playing back the podcast to try to edit it. It takes a while. It's a tedious work. With any podcast, I'd try to recommend maybe like a nice intro or an outro to the podcast, something along the lines of this.
Welcome to the Resolve Family Ministry Podcast. This podcast is a
Or
ministry.
this for the outro.
Thanks so much for listening to today's Idea Talks. If you benefited from this podcast,
You don't have to be that elaborate. You don't have to have something that intros the podcast, tells you what it's about, gives an intro. Maybe it's just you talking and starting the podcast. That's okay. But ideally, as soon as the listener presses play on their smartphone or however they're going to listen to your podcast, it doesn't just launch into the podcast blindly like a cold open, like an SNL sketch. There's some kind of transition there. For soundtracks, of course, I'm always going to recommend Epidemic Sound. Epidemic Sound is fantastic for all of your audio choices. I'm logged into my account. I can go to browse here for Epidemic Sound. And let's say I want to go to my favorite new genre of music here for all my videos, hip hop and old school hip hop. I can sort by the actual release date, something that's new, and I can scroll down. What's the one that I like? Sarah the Instrumentalist. This is really good. So she has some really cool tracks that I'll play here for you. Really great. Kind of fast forward a little bit. I'll bore you for my hip hop jams. So that's really nice. But one thing I love about Epidemic Sound, specifically as it comes to podcast, is this section right here, and that's the length. So let's say you want to do a quick 20 to 30 second bumper, as it were, for the podcast, for the intro. You can actually click 30 seconds and see which of these specific genre have a trimmed down version of a song that's only for 30 seconds. That way you don't have to do a drastic fade or drastic fade out in your editing platform. The tracks are already cut to that 30-second mark for you. That's a really nice feature of Epidemic Sound. The last thing in the editing phase that I want to talk about is really like, what are you editing? So you're editing out any obvious accidents that happen. Maybe you sneezed or coughed on the microphone. Don't leave that in there. Just please. Take it out. Take the time to trim down the audio for just a little bit. Just take it out. It's okay. You're editing out ums like I just did. Those type of things, the listener will notice, and it'll make your podcast go from good to great very quickly if you take the time just to do that. The other thing that a lot of people don't think about, especially if you're recording multiple voices at a time, a best practice is when one voice is talking and the other voice is not, take that audio out. So if I have a conversation going on between two people, person number one is talking, the entire time when person number two is not talking, delete or mute that audio. It'll make the audio sound so much crisper and clear when there's not multiple background noises happening when the other person is talking. Just a quick tip for you. Now, the last section here is really truly when you get to publish your podcast and share it with the world. You've already picked your hosting platform where you're going to store all your podcast footage on and try to actually get your RSS feed generated via Squarespace or what have you. You've picked your recording equipment, you've picked your frequency, you've already done your due diligence about what kind of equipment you're going to use as far as mic goes. You've purchased something like Skype call recorder or Ecamm call recorder to try to actually capture the audio. Now you're ready to publish. So what do? Now, I've been talking about this thing called an RSS feed and an iTunes Connect thing where you're actually trying to get your approval process on the iTunes store. Why is it so important? The iTunes store for podcast is the largest directory of podcasts in the entire world. There's other platforms like Google Play, like Stitcher Radio, like Spotify that you can actually submit your podcast to. I would recommend that over time. By far, the largest directory is the one through iTunes in the iTunes store. So that's the one I recommend. So what does that process look like? Once you've uploaded your feed and generated that RSS feed from the hosting site, you're going to go to the iTunes Connect and actually sign in using your Apple ID and submit that link for approval. The approval process could take anywhere from 24 hours up to maybe a couple weeks. So don't be in a rush to try to get your first episode out and be expecting to wait in this process a little bit longer. And then finally, once you're actually there for approval, once you've published and got approval for the podcast, that's the last time you have to touch iTunes Connect. Because every single time you submit a new podcast through your podcast feed, it automatically updates on all platforms. And that's the magic of it. It's a one-stop shop for trying to get approval. And then from there on out, it updates from that point going forward. Obviously, you can share your podcast with your audience on many different platforms, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, what have you. But the biggest thing is you're just trying to get the word out about your podcast afterwards that you've actually published it. If you have some people that are really dedicated to your podcast, eventually they can subscribe to your podcast and they'll get constant notifications of when you publish a new episode. If they turn into regular subscribers, they'll automatically be knowing when you're going to publish a new podcast based on your frequency and your schedule. So that's it for today's video, folks. I hope you got something out of it. I hope now you know from step 1 all the way till step number 7 that you can try to publish your own podcast. Good luck, and I hope this video has helped you.